What's up, guys? Welcome back to Roensch Capital Charts. Today we're taking a look at Palantir stock, ticker symbol PLTR, on a variety of time frames in anticipation of the next trading day, Tuesday, March 5th. Alright guys, Palantir stock here today, down about 89 cents a share, 3.57%. Let's take a look at this name and try to pull out as much bias as we can out of today's volatile trading day, and then take a look at what, from my perspective, are going to be the most important levels to keep an eye on from a day-to-day perspective. Really focusing on tomorrow. Now this here is the intraday 1-minute chart, but what I want to do today is actually start on the 5-minute chart and take a look at our kind of volume profile daily ritual that we're doing. And I'm going to include that little bit of a pop that we saw in pre-market right around 7 a.m. Eastern time. Guys, if you haven't already, by the way, and if you're new here and you haven't done so, Palantir is one of the stocks that I cover every single day. This is a company that I love, so please subscribe to the channel, and I will continue to do my best to provide you value every single day. So here on the 5-minute chart, I think it is the most contextual to look at an intraday volume profile. It's not so zoomed in, where we get too thin of volume bars, so to speak, and it's not like so zoomed out like a 4-hour chart or an hourly, where it becomes almost impossible to really pick out the little intraday moves that can give us some insight into a larger sample size bias coming from the overall market. So what we're really doing here every day is I'm looking for pretty decent changes in volume, obvious changes in volume, that are outside of the confines of what would be contextual at that time of day, but also correlate with an obvious move in stock price. Okay, so looking at this, well, like, what are the most obvious moves of the day? Well, for me, it's kind of this downside move off the open. Granted, we expect higher volume off the open, so we can kind of wash that out. Really, I'm looking at this move downside and then the recovery. Okay, the problem with the downside move is that it was really only 2 5-minute bars. Ideally, for a decent volume profile look, I prefer to have like 3 or 4 or maybe more. The more the better. I think 3 or 4 kind of at a minimum. And 2 bars, fine. We did see a little bit of a pop in volume that does kind of exceed what we saw around that region. So, bulls, understand if you are in like chat rooms or forums tonight, you may see some bears, if they're paying close enough attention, kind of boasting about that downside move. But 2 things here that I would say. It was only 2 bars. It's kind of hard to be contextual with only 2 bars, and I would say the same thing if this were a bullish move, by the way. And on top of that, we saw quite the recovery, right? Now, granted, the volume on the recovery it did fade, but that is contextual during time of day, and we actually saw some decent volume hold out for 5 straight 5-minute bars there following that 2-bar fall. Now, the other move that I do want to look at is this move upside in the pre-market, and we actually did see a little bit of increased volume that was outside of the context of what is normal during that time, somewhere around 300,000 shares. And then on the pullback of that move, right, we actually saw a big fade in volume pre-market. Granted, it is a much smaller sample size that we're dealing with, but it's the same kind of look, right? Big volume that correlates with an upside move or a downside move, in this case an upside move. And then we saw a much lower volume fade, but again, take it with a bit of a grain of salt because the overall sample size of that look is quite a bit lower, being that early in pre-market. All right, let's move on now to the 30-minute chart and start really looking at levels that I'm paying close attention to come tomorrow, Tuesday. Now, interestingly here today, if we look at like the end of after hours on Friday, we saw us break downside through the 200 period here on the 30-minute chart. That gray line's the 200 period, the white line's the 50 period. The 2 most, by the way, commonly used moving average time frames on most chart time frames. So really what I want to do here, again, I believe TA is all a self-fulfilling prophecy, and that's exactly the way I want it, is I want to look at the most popular indicators on the most popular time frames. That's why we're looking at the 200 and the 50 on the 30-minute, the 4-hour, and the daily chart, because it gets the most eyeballs and is the most supportive of that self-fulfilling prophecy mentality. But late in after hours on a Friday night, we saw a break downside through the 200 period, and we had to take that with a grain of salt because naturally volume does fade after hours. Okay, and then pre-market this morning, same deal. We saw a break back upside and a test of the 50. Have to take it with a grain of salt because the overall sample size of volume is lower. And then today on bigger volume, we gave up the 200, reclaimed it, but we struggled to hold it and gave it up into the close. However, that has now dragged the 50 period downside, and the 200 period is going to be slower to react. So it's kind of on the same path as it has been, forming a much tighter channel. So bulls, here's what I'm looking at tomorrow. Any upside move that could reclaim both of these in kind of one swipe, the 200 period and the 50 period, get the stock up to like 24.50, punch through the 50 period after getting through the 200 period, and then ideally see a downside retest of the 50 period and then a higher volume pull away. Any volume that's kind of average or above, ideally above average or higher, to me would be great. Anything except for below average volume. Now, if you are a bear heading into tomorrow, yours is pretty clear. Ideally, you'd love to see that 50 period continue downside because it's going to react more quickly than the 200 period. So it would not hurt to see a downside crossover, the 50 crossing over the 200, not because of any like death cross mentality or something like that. I think that really is a silly way to trade, just because it adds a kind of psychological barrier to the stock that can just get lower more quickly than the 200 period can. So, because ideally, if you're a bear, you'd want to see this 50 period continuing lower while the stock also goes lower, lowering any psychological barriers, getting deeper into a bear territory. If you are a bear, I think that's what ideally you'd be looking for here come Tuesday. All right. Now let's move on to the 4-hour chart. You can see here that the 50 period on the 4-hour chart is incredibly in play as of right now. You know, again, after it was all kind of said and done on Friday evening, we were left in a similar spot as to where we are now. Just barely kind of giving that up. So come tomorrow, it's a really simple story. I think at least on the 4-hour chart, it's just going to be basically a battle of the 50 period, which currently sits just below 24 bucks a share, kind of right at like 23.95. So bulls, just a hold of that would be beautiful. A much cleaner respective support, kind of like what we saw back on February 28th. A support bounce like that would be a beautiful thing to see. Again, on as high volume as possible, pulling away from that 50 period. Bears, exact opposite for you. Anything above average volume and a break downside through the 50 period, but a more, I would say, sustained break, like a downside move and then retest and then hard fade, a clean rejection on any volume that's not below average. Now, let's go to the most important chart of all. That's going to be the daily chart, okay? And if we zoom in here, we can get a really contextual view. Now, as you guys know, if you've listened to the channel here for any period of time, by the way, I appreciate you doing so, the daily is always going to be the most contextual. It paints the most obvious picture of what's really going on in the stock. Now, it doesn't include after hours movement. Right now, the stock is a little bit lower after hours. That is likely going to change, though, as I'm recording this early in the after hours here on Monday. And we always have to take after hours with a grain of salt anyway because volume is so low. But the stock being somewhere around 24 bucks a share as of right now, to me, the obvious story is 3 levels because the moving averages are not even in the question. They're both below 20 bucks a share. The obvious story to me is if I'm a bull, any downside test of 23, that's a technical level that we've had drawn forever here on Palantir. I would ideally want to see that hold. I don't want to see 23 break, okay? But even before that occurs, I would love to see 24 become more of a technical level than it already is and hold that whole dollar and use it as kind of like a trampoline to get back up toward 25, which is a much more important psychological number, right? Bears, 25 is like the equivalent of 23 to a bull for you. 25, I would argue, is even more crucial because it's such an important psychological level. If you're a bear, any test of 25, you want to see a hard rejection immediately. 24, you would love to hold below as a resistance level, kind of claim that as more of a shorter term resistance since we haven't had that if you're a bear as of late. Anything to head down toward 23 bucks a share on high volume would be ideal because the ultimate goal here in the near term, obviously, is to break through 23. I think that's an obvious level that most people are going to be able to look at here and probably already have drawn. Now, I want to be very clear with TA here. The levels, typically this is how it works. A psychological level, oftentimes a round number, becomes a technical level. Every once in a while, like that 2130 range, you'll have kind of a more seemingly random region turn into a strong technical, and oftentimes it's because there was something existing around that region at the time that it became a technical level. Psychological levels typically become technical levels, and technical levels, if they're obvious enough, typically become psychological levels. But it's always a range, right? Like I have this level drawn at 22.97. I know it's 23. It's a range around 23. It's never an exact penny unless you're trading a stock that's like $1, right? Which we're not right now. Now let's take a look here at what was the bias out of the options traders here on Monday. And this is very typical of Palantir. 454,000 total contracts traded. 346,000 of those were calls, and only 107,000 of those were puts. So we are seeing a heavy call side bias here on Palantir stock today. And if we break it down by time frame, kind of the short-term speculators, right? That 0 to 20 delta range, about 100,000 calls and about 43,000 puts. Not only that, but in addition to that, every other delta range here is also leaning to the call side. This has been very typical of Palantir as of late. It has been one of those names that for whatever reason has just leaned extremely heavily to the call side for weeks straight. I don't expect that to last forever, of course, but I think it's imperative that we take note of that at least as just one factor of many. Of course, the options traders can, of course, be wrong. We always have to make sure our risk is managed, but it's important to take each factor, understand the factor, and then not only look at the factors that support our bias. We have to weigh them all, okay? Listen, if you got value out of this video, please subscribe to the channel, leave a like before you head out. I'm curious, what's your time frame on Palantir? Are you trading the stock or are you in this for the long term? Let me know in the comment section down below. I appreciate you guys, and I'll see you tomorrow.